Hi, you've tuned in to Radio Northern Beaches, your Listen Local station, right here on the Northern Beaches of Sydney. You can find us on your radio dial at 88.7 and 90.3 FM. Can't get to a radio? No worries. You can always stream our program live from anywhere in the world at rnb.org.au. And for listening on your own schedule, our podcasts are available globally at rnbpodcast.com.au. So be sure to follow and subscribe so you don't miss any episodes. Now, here is our latest podcast.
Hello again, listeners to Community Radio Northern Beaches, 88.7 and 90.3 FM, streaming live on our website, www.rnb.org.au. Our program is Innovation Talk, and I'm Michael Lester. It's an economic nostrum, not to say conventional wisdom, that in the long run, all that really matters in economics and policy is productivity. Productivity is seen and understood to be the principal driver of economic growth, and more importantly, the driver of improvement, long-run improvement in living standards measured by, let's say, GDP per capita. So we've had a bit of a productivity slowdown. The Treasurer has made it clear that the government's priority economically is productivity improvement and reform to overcome this stalled productivity and growth in living standards. He said that having spent the first term tackling inflation, they're now going to be focused very much on policies and reforms to improve productivity. I'm very pleased to welcome to the program Michael Brennan. Michael's the Chief Executive Officer of the independent E61 economic think tank. Michael was the former chair of the Productivity Commission, the government's principal advisor on these matters over the years and decades, and also previously the Deputy Secretary of Treasury. Thanks so much for taking the time to join us, Michael.
No worries, Michael. Great pleasure to be here.
Can you share with us an idea of what economists mean by the concept of productivity?
Yeah, in its simplest term, productivity is about getting more for less. But economically, it's a little more complicated than that because economists, of course, have come up with ways to try and measure that very concept. And so the economic definition of productivity is GDP per hour worked for labour productivity. And there's also other measures that try to incorporate the inputs of other things other than labour. But when you think about what that measure is trying to get at, GDP is effectively our best measure of how much we produce in a given year. It's not a perfect measure or a perfect proxy of living standards, but it's not bad as measures go, both to track our progress over time and across countries. And we compare that to the labour input, the hours worked in the economy, to try and work out for every hour that's being worked, how much is being produced. So crudely, that's what productivity is. In many ways, I think productivity is misunderstood and much maligned. In the popular discourse, I think productivity is often mistakenly viewed as an edict to get workers to work harder, whereas in reality, over the long sweep of history, what it's meant is fewer hours of work, but more output in return. And that's been a long process of mechanisation, of science, of innovation, of learning how to do things more effectively and more cheaply. When I was at the Productivity Commission, we tried to boil this down a bit into more concrete terms that people could understand. They're a little bit less abstract and a bit less mathematical. So we did this thought experiment of, if you were to purchase a loaf of bread in 1900, how many minutes would it take you at the average wage to have enough money to afford a loaf of bread? So it's a kind of cost of living measure, but it tells you something about the cost of production of a loaf of bread and the value of your time doing whatever it is that you're doing. And the answer was it took about 20 minutes of your time at the average wage to afford a loaf of bread in 1900. And if you fast forward to the current day, it's more like 4 minutes. And that, in effect, is the effect of productivity, the reality that what once took 20 minutes at the average wage to have enough wherewithal to purchase a particular item, now you can do that in 4 minutes. And that's a function of all of the things that have gone into improving the process of making a loaf of bread. So you think of all of the technology and innovation that's gone into agriculture that have expanded crop yields on wheat farms. So that's new crop types, it's fertilizers, it's pesticides, but it's all the mechanisation that's gone in, the replacement of horses with harvesters and tractors and that sort of thing. And it's all of the mechanisation that's gone on in the factory that might make the loaf of bread and all of those things. So in a way, it's kind of the best demonstration of the way that things, and one of the channels that productivity growth takes is things get more accessible, more affordable over time because they're less costly to make because we work out how to do them better.
As you're saying, there's a lot of other factors that drive productivity besides labor and its own quality and quantity. Economists focus on not only measuring that, but they also measure, don't they, the capital, the productivity of capital and investment.
They do. That's right. So alongside that measure of labor productivity, so GDP per hour worked, economists also use other measures, including total factor productivity, which tries also to take into account how much additional capital is going into a production process. And that reflects the fact that capital is not free, it's not costless. It requires labor to create the capital. So it's an important input as well. And perhaps surprisingly, we have experienced over the long haul positive total factor productivity growth. So even accounting for increased labor and increased capital, we produce more than proportional increases in output, and that's total factor productivity. What's interesting about the economics profession is that when the study of economic growth, at least in a mathematical form, really took off in about the 1940s or 1950s, this process was regarded as slightly mysterious. The fact that there was this total factor productivity, this residual, if you like, an economy might increase its labor because of population growth, and it might increase its capital by certain percentage amounts, and output would grow by even more. And this was regarded as a slightly mysterious thing. And it's economists set about trying to explain, why is it that we observe this residual? Why is it that we observe this progress over time?
What's been the story with Australia's productivity performance across industries and within industries by companies?
Yes, well, it's always important to distinguish productivity levels from productivity growth. When we talk about productivity struggling in Australia, generally we're talking about the growth rate, that it's not growing particularly fast. Different sectors, of course, have different levels of productivity. If you're thinking about what is the output of a sector relative to the hours of work, for example, if we're thinking labour productivity, then it's pretty obvious that different sectors of the economy have vastly different levels of productivity. So the mining industry has very high and measured levels of labour productivity because it's actually not very labour intensive at all. It's highly capital intensive, but producing a lot of output. More service-based industries, hairdressing or personal services or even professional services, tend to have lower levels of measured productivity because they're highly labour intensive. So that's not to say that we should take all of the resources of the economy and put them into the most capital intensive sectors. It wouldn't necessarily work that way at all. But different sectors have different absolute levels of productivity. The interesting question for Australia is when we compare ourselves to overseas peers, how, for example, would Australia's manufacturing sector or mining sector or agricultural sector compare to its overseas peers? For the most part, when that sort of work has been done, Australia tends to do very well, perhaps unsurprisingly, in agriculture and in mining, two sectors where Australia has long had a competitive advantage. We've had ample land, we've had ample resources, but there are also sectors where those industries have been exposed to global trade for a very long time. They're very innovative and they're things that Australia does well. Manufacturing in Australia has never been particularly at the frontier, and there's quite a gap between productivity levels in Europe or the United States in manufacturing and those in Australia. And then in the services sector, it just varies. But we have some services sectors. On some evidence, our services sector is not too bad by international comparison.
I just wonder how significant the actual structure of the economy is itself in both determining and setting limits to or opportunities for productivity, rates of improvement and growth and overall productivity, and to what extent try to change productivity, if you like, at the economy-wide level is a matter of looking at the structures and influencing the structure of the economy.
I think it's a fascinating question. So if you think about the way productivity growth occurred over much of the 20th century, when we think about those what I'll describe as those traditional goods sectors, so thinking agriculture, manufacturing, mining that I've mentioned, we can look back and discern the path of the productivity growth took in each of those sectors. And for the most part, it was more automation or more mechanization, so labor being replaced by capital on the farm, in the factory, on the mining site. And there was pretty significant productivity growth in those traditional goods sectors. Now, I also think for those working in those sectors, productivity was a pretty intuitive concept. The idea that you're trying to get more wheat for a hectare of land, or you're trying to get more output across the production line in a given period of time or for a given number of raw materials, or the idea that you're trying to extract ore more efficiently and get it to the port and onto the ship more quickly and cheaply. I think those things are very intuitive to the business manager, to the worker, to the shareholder. So productivity kind of looms large at the business level. If you contrast that with the services sector, and bearing in mind the services sector is now 80% of the economy. It's about 90% of the workforce. Productivity growth is firstly a little less intuitive, I think, if you're working in a cafe or you're working in an aged care facility or a hospital or a school. What exactly is productivity growth? I think it's an important concept still, but it's a less intuitive concept to the people at the coalface, if you like, than it was in those traditional goods industries. It's also harder to measure, and it's probably harder to obtain. And this is your point. In a world where 80% of the economy is services, is it going to be the case that we'll be able to drive the same sort of productivity growth over time that we saw in sectors like agriculture, manufacturing, and mining? And I think that is genuinely an open question. So the story of agriculture is fascinating because around the turn of the 20th century, so in the year 1901, agriculture in Australia comprised about 25% of the workforce. So a quarter of our workforce was involved in agricultural production. Today, it would be about 4%, but we're producing vastly more agricultural output. And that, in many ways, is the story of productivity growth, the way labour was then freed up to do other things. And over time, it led to the growth of the services sector. Now, if we think about a couple of the really big employing industries of today, health, welfare, disability, education, some of those large service sectors, would we see the same thing over the next 100 years? Would we see the same process by which mechanisation, technology means that we have vastly fewer people doing those jobs, but much better outcomes and much more quality service being provided to people? Maybe it's possible, but it's a little harder to imagine. So there are some services that have been highly innovative, finance, for example, where we now do a lot of banking on our phones, where we used to go into branches. So that's been an example of radical transformation and productivity growth in one sector. But there are others where it's a little harder to envisage what that could look like. And so your point is right. I think the structure of an economy can have implications for the outlook for productivity growth. There's not a lot we can do about it. It's not a good idea for us to try and limit the services sector and send everybody back to manufacturing and mining. I mean, these are fundamental economic shifts and they reflect society's preferences. But it does open up a question going forward about how hard or easy it's going to be to have the same sort of productivity growth rates.
Our guest on Innovation Talk Radio Northern Beach is Michael Brennan, the CEO of the independent think tank E61 Institute. We're talking about the subject of productivity, the stalled productivity performance, and hence stalled living standards, arguably over quite a long period, not only globally, but particularly in Australia, and what might be done about it. There's a lot of countries, including Australia at the moment, and notably America with MEGA, trying to rebuild their manufacturing industry sector. We used to have a large manufacturing industry sector. We seem to be aiming under current government policies also to build more stuff in Australia and rebuild it. If these attempts are successful, is this likely to, in itself, boost the productivity performance of the country, is it?
I think it's very unlikely, and I think it's unlikely to be successful, partly because the instruments that you have to use, things like tariff protection or a whole lot of taxpayer-funded subsidies, tend to be wasteful and inefficient. But I also think there's a sense of holding back the tide, King Canute-like. There's really not a country in the world where the manufacturing sector today is bigger than it was 20 or 30 years ago. It's possibly true in Bangladesh, but it's not true in China, for example. It's not true in a whole range of middle-income countries. Every country, as it progresses in economic development, sees its manufacturing sector shrink and its services sector grow. That's a kind of fundamental pattern of economic growth. So in a way, to want to be back in the days when we were more of a manufacturing country is to effectively say we wish we were a lower income country again. For the most part, when policymakers talk about wanting to bring back manufacturing, it's either one of two things. There's a kind of nostalgia about steel jobs or factory jobs that existed in particular locations often. And this is particularly salient in the United States, where there's a view that the opening up of global trade, particularly China, really hollowed out much of the South and the Midwest. Now, in Australia, we didn't have anything quite like that, right? We had a bit of restructuring in the 1990s and 80s, but the rise of China for us was a totally different story. It was all about exporting minerals, getting high prices. It was overall a big economic gain to Australia. But the other thing people talk about is moving into things like advanced manufacturing, which are much less labour intensive, more technological. It's not that that isn't, in some cases, a good opportunity for Australia, but it tends to be an opportunity that a lot of other countries are also pursuing and can take advantage of. So you have to be really sure, if you're going to put taxpayers' money into it or really try and direct the resources of an economy into particular things, I think you've got to be pretty confident that it's an area where we can do something better than anybody else in the world. And that's not, in most cases, altogether clear in a lot of these advanced manufacturing areas. So, I think you've got to tread carefully with that kind of interventionist policy.
What about the impact of technology, which you've referred to in the past? We've seen a lot of technological investment, and even in late part of last century, in the 90s, with the digital technology and whatever. But even at that point, there was controversy about how to measure that and what impact, and some people actually speculating that these new digital technologies weren't showing up in productivity at all, despite investment. Recently, the OECD, in reporting on industrial economies and their poor productivity, seems to put a lot of weight on the impact of future AI developments as a significant boost to productivity across the board in OECD economies. What's the strength of that proposition?
In general, it's pretty strong, and the technology has always been at the root cause of productivity, or if you like, it's technology combined with a degree of business innovation. So it's technology which is put to good economic use and aimed at and which drives economic value. And when I described earlier that sort of path, long-term path of productivity growth, you can see it's largely the development and deployment of technology that is driving the improvement in output relative to inputs. I am at pains to emphasize you do need that combination. It's not just about technology for its own sake. I mean, there have been countries in the past that were highly technologically advanced but economically backward. The Soviet Union, for example, that system was capable of driving a lot of technological development, but not necessarily economic development. So it does have to be technology that's geared towards things that people value, and ideally that's via a market system. Now, the question is twofold. Do some of these technological innovations, when they come along, result in a bit of undercounting? And they probably do. I mean, we have things today that, Wikipedia, for example, which is a free good, and that used to be something we paid for in the form of encyclopedias that sat on the shelf. Are we fully taking into account the benefit that we're getting out of some of those free digitally provided goods that we previously paid for? And the answer to that is probably not. But I think those who, others would still point to the fact that we have seen, as you say, productivity slow down over time. The effect of that undercounting as a result of digital goods and other technology isn't big enough to really explain the slowdown. And you've got to remember too, some of that undercounting existed back then in relation to some of the big technological breakthroughs of yesteryear, like electricity or the radio or television and whatnot. So yes, technology is the big driver of productivity growth. Does it lead to some undercounting? Probably. It's always hard to, GDP is an imperfect measure of production, but certainly living standards. As we look to the future, is AI a big game changer? I mean, I think it potentially is. It has a lot of potential to automate tasks, particularly in those services sectors that I mentioned. And so anything that successfully complements labour and frees labour up to do the sort of higher value human bits and get a little bit out of some of the drudgery is a good thing generally for productivity. Now, how big the sort of productivity boost is, we don't know. And it will depend both on the pace of AI development, but also the use case, the deployment, how rapidly it diffuses through the economy and how adept we are at finding good ways to use it.
Discussion here on Innovation Talk with Michael Brennan, the Chief Executive of E61 Institute, an independent economic think tank. And we're focusing on the question of the productivity challenge and opportunity facing Australia right across the economy on many dimensions. I understand that government has just referred to your old organisation, the Productivity Commission, its advisor, a request for a report about the 5 pillars which need to be attacked. What is this framework and what sort of agenda is that setting?
The first thing to say is that despite a lot of the terms of the policy debate in Australia as it unfolds, as it plays out, it's a little unfair to blame government in all cases for a slowdown in productivity growth. Right? Productivity growth is something, as I mentioned earlier with my description of agriculture over the last century, it's something that unfolds over very long periods of time. It is quite gradual, it's quite evolutionary, and it's a little bit mysterious. And the productivity growth rates over time will tend to ebb and flow. And overwhelmingly, what it reflects is large-scale societal trends, technology, new innovations, firm and management decision-making in the private sector. The role of government is really just to create the sort of environment in which productivity can grow. And by that, I mean the sort of environment in which people, firms, decision makers are open to new technologies, new business models, open to a degree of experimentation, are pretty adept when they observe something working over here at trying it over there. So an economic system that creates the right incentives and signals to people to innovate and spread good innovations across the economy. That simply put is the sort of policy framework that you want to have. Now, of course, in any developed economy with a pretty active government, there are going to be all manner of policy areas where government, perhaps for other unrelated reasons, has gotten involved and put in place policies or regulations that might limit or inhibit the ability of good ideas to spread across the economy. And often that's what productivity policy is about. It's about lifting the capability of our society to develop and then deploy new technology, to develop good ideas, to spread them, to reward good ideas when they come along. So the sorts of policies that people generally talk about are making sure that our regulation is efficient and targeted at the harms we're really trying to prevent, but not getting in the way too much of new innovation. It's partly about what economists refer to as human capital, but the quality of education, the quality of skills that the workforce has, because that's an important factor in coming up with and adopting new ideas. So the quality of the education system is a very important factor. Increasingly, and one of the pillars that the federal government has referred to the Productivity Commission is the care economy. So as I referred to earlier, that's a bit of the services sector where the government is heavily involved, where it can be very difficult to drive productivity growth, but because it's such a rapidly growing sector with aged care and NDIS and health and all the rest, it's actually quite important that we continue to think hard about how we might get productivity growth in those sectors. And in some cases, that might be about freeing them up to think about where they can economise a little bit on the labour input in delivering their service. And of course, for Australia, as for much of the world, there's a big story that overhangs a lot of this, which is the climate transition, which is, again, something of a productivity story, because what we're trying to do here is reduce a cost. It's a cost that we haven't counted within GDP or within firm profits, but at the cost of carbon emissions. We're trying to reduce that, but we're trying to do it in the way that is least expensive and most efficient. And so how we manage that transition, the quality of the investments that we make, whether we can achieve the net zero goal in the least cost, most efficient way, is actually going to be fundamental to Australia's overall productivity performance. These are all areas of public policy which are highly relevant to productivity. They're in many ways a handful of the 5 pillars that the Productivity Commission has been given to come back to the government.
Quite an agenda, and the Productivity Commission, as I'm sure you personally are well aware, has been advising the government for a long time, doing lots of reports. In fact, I think fairly recently, preceding the one they're doing now, I think they put out a report, maybe it was with you, I don't know, Advancing Prospects in 2023. And it's so mind-boggling because there seem to be about 30 directions for reform, a 1,000-page report with 70 or 80 recommendations. Trying to create a priority agenda with big impact must be a big challenge. You've mentioned a number of the areas: workforce and education, the care sector and the services sector, the energy transition. Each of these is a huge challenge. And as you say, too, we need a dynamic economy that's competitive and engaged in world trade. What a challenge that is. And we've talked about technology. In fact, I think we stepped down the minister with responsibilities for innovation, and whether we're going to tackle that as part of the technology agenda remains to be seen. I guess the question I'd like to ask as we move to close is, there have been lots of recommendations, and yet politicians have found it very, very hard to take things up. The too hard basket, as it's referred. So although everyone seems to know this is important, we tend not to do much about it. What's likely about change now, and why has it been so difficult?
I think it's difficult because, as I say, some of the policies that exist, to the extent you're ever recommending some form of policy reform, you're going to be up against some vested interest, because that is reflected in the policy as it stands today. It's the way it is for a reason. And also people in the economy have adapted to the policies and the regulations as they exist. So there will be a degree of resistance to change. That's true when you try to change the tax system. It's true when you try and change some aspect of regulation or make significant change to the budget. So I think that's kind of a given. A lot depends on the capacity of not only elected representatives, but participants in the policy debate, people like you and me, to articulate why we think something is important, why we think the long-term benefits outweigh the costs, and kind of in good faith setting out the case and having confidence that the community will go along with that if they perceive that the overarching goal, like raising productivity growth or achieving net zero or making housing more affordable or whatever one of these significant kind of overarching policy goals is, that's worth a little bit of pain on the way through. I'm reasonably confident. I mean, not that the government will pick up the Productivity Commission's report and adopt all of its recommendations and proceed to enact them. It won't. That's not how it works. But that there will be a degree of momentum behind some things, and I think sometimes it's a longer term, slower burn. Sometimes it's about educating the policy making process and the public debate about why these things are important and where policy ought to head. I mean, we've had at the E61 Institute a bit of a win. The government recently adopted not so much a recommendation, but an empirical finding of ours that there had been a significant rise in the use of non-compete agreements in labour contracts across the economy. That we felt that this could be limiting the ability of workers to move across firms and thereby limiting the efficient allocation of labour and good ideas moving from one place to another as they move via people, and also firms and workers kind of coming together and finding their perfect match, if you like. So we thought non-compete agreements in contracts were a barrier to that. The government, we provided a fair bit of empirical evidence to that effect. The government in the last budget announced that they would move to effectively ban non-compete agreements below an income threshold. So I think there are positive steps out there where you've got the right sort of issue that you can get the right evidence behind and support within government. I think it is possible to drive these positive changes.
Well, that's a nice positive example of the opportunity and the ability to pick up reform. But clearly, as we've been discussing, given all these complexities about productivity, reform and improvement, there's no single silver bullet that's magically going to solve our problems. It's going to take long-term action over a lot of fronts. As you say, the key question at the bottom line of productivity, as we said at the beginning, is to answer the question, are you better off? It's all very well to talk about all these concepts about GDP and productivity, but at the end of the day, presumably this is about making people better off and having better standard of living. Economists are very good at offering advice, and we've been talking all the time here with productivity about the concept of efficiency, but they perhaps don't really have a role and certainly don't pretend to offer much one in the question of equality and equity. So it's one thing to say that we can boost productivity and the growth of the GDP overall per capita, but what's the reality of achieving equality so that people share the benefits of this productivity improvement? Is that a challenge at the bottom line of productivity improvement?
I think it's a challenge that every democratic country or every country really faces, and some are more effective than others. Every country has its own culture and its own preferences. So, for example, I would say in Australia, we probably prize a degree of equality, certainly a degree of equality of opportunity, but even a degree of equality of in the income distribution than, for example, the United States. And that's just a kind of political reality that our system has to deal with, and their system will deal with in different ways, and Europe will deal with in still further ways. And generally, yes, it is an important part of this process that people feel that they have a stake in improving the overall wealth of a country, that it's not all the wealth isn't being captured by a lucky or well-connected few. Much of the kind of instruments of government in a democratic country like ours is focused on ensuring that the benefits are broadly spread. And an interesting point on this is we often act as though there is a trade-off sometimes between having better economic growth and equality. That if you have more equality, less inequality, you'll sort of hold back the economy, and vice versa, that a really strong economy will leave some people behind and result in an underclass. Globally, when you look at countries that have relatively high levels of inequality, they also tend to be low-income countries. And that kind of stands to reason. Some of the reasons why they're so unequal are also the reasons why economic growth has been held back in those countries. And it's often because there are high levels of corruption, high levels of rent seeking, well-connected firms and family members extracting all of the mining rights or subsidies from the government.
Well, that is a very important point about the relationship, but one could equally point to a country like America with its political turmoil and questioning of democracy. It's a country that's grown very, very well, had very wealthy still GDP per capita. It's got huge levels of inequality, notwithstanding, which is leading to the questioning of the very democratic project that is America. Clearly, the way these gains of productivity are distributed is a key factor in the
Absolutely.
realization of these things. Look, I'd like to thank you very much, Michael Brennan, Chief Executive of E61 Institute, for joining us on Innovation Talk Radio Northern Beaches to talk about the productivity challenges and opportunities facing Australia. Thanks very much indeed for joining us, Michael.
Thanks, Michael.
Australia, the lucky country. We've got meat pies. We've got the world's best beer. But most importantly, top of the list, we've got Radio Northern Beaches 88.7, 90.3. Now hitting the entire world on www.rmb.org.au.